Page 316, we continue with Kaddish Shalom. Yitgadal v'yikadash Shemei Rabbah, ve'almad divrach yurteh, v'yamlich malchuteh, b'chayachon v'yom achron, v'edo kol Beit Yisrael, b'agalav yizman kari v'yimeru, Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah mevorach, le'olam le'ol maya, yidbarach, yidbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitvar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shemei kudusha barechu, Leila min kol berchata v'shirata, tishbechata v'nechemata, Damiran b'yama v'yimeru, Amen. Tid gavot sotahon, avotahon, dechol Yisrael, kadamo d'shmaya v'yimeru, Amen. Yeh shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimeru, Amen. Osei shalom b'mroma, v'uyasei shalom. Aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimeru, Amen. We invite everyone to please rise as we'll make Kiddush together and Havdalah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol am, v'romamanu mikol lashon, v'kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. V'titen lanu Adonai Eloheinu bi'ava, moadim l'simcha, hagim uzmanim l'sason. Et yom hag ha-shavuot hazeh, zman matan Toratenu, mikra kodesh, zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim, ki vanu v'charta, v'yotanu kidashta mikol hamim, u'moadei kodshecha, v'simcha v'sason hinchaltanu, Baruch atah Adonai, mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei meorei. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamavdil bein kodesh lechol, bein or lechoshech, bein Yisrael le'amin, bein yom hashvi'i l'sheshet yamei hamaseh, bein kedushat Shabbat lekudashat yom tov hivdalta, v'et yom hashvi'i misheshet yamei hamaseh kedashta hivdalta v'kidashta et amecha Yisrael v'kudashatecha. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil bein kodesh lekodesh. Shechianu, excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higyanu lazman hazeh. No, that is the Havdalah. That was it? Because we're going from Shavuot. Page 320, we continue with Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, atei gdula le'yotzev reshit, shelo asanu ki'ei ha'atzot, shot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkeinu kahem, v'gor aleinu k'kol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, u'mishtachavim u'modim, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, קדוש ברוך הוא. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה melech kol haaretz. Yom ha'u, vayom ha'u, yeh Adonai echad, u'shemo, u'shemo, u'shemo echad. And we'll conclude with the Mourner's Kaddish, page 324. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'galav yizman kari v'yimeru, amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam u'me'omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei kudusha barechu. Le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechemata, damiran be'alma v'yimeru, amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru, amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, uyaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru, amen. Baruch Tiyah. Thanks so much, everyone. We've made it through the course of the Omer, and now arrive Shavuot.
Welcome, everybody. It's nice to have you with us this evening, and it's a pleasure to welcome our scholar with us to our congregation, Dr. Sergey Frolov, and just listen to his background, and you will appreciate that we are in the presence of a very special individual. Dr. Sergey Frolov, who has an MA and a PhD from Leningrad University, an MA and a PhD from Claremont Graduate University, is professor of religious studies and the Nate and Anne Levine Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies at SMU. He teaches a wide range of courses, including Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, the History of Judaism, Religion and the Holocaust, the Feminine Divine, and Love and Death in Ancient Mythology. He has authored 250 articles in English and Russian. His areas of research are biblical hermeneutics and theology, history and religions of the ancient Near East, and Jewish history and thought. Before joining SMU in 2002, Dr. Frolov worked for the National Library of Russia and the Shorter Jewish Encyclopedia in Russia. I've never seen that. Has that been published?
That's your loss.
I'm sure. Absolutely.
It's published. It's also online.
It's also online.
It's also online, yeah.
Okay.
I read it in Russian, so I don't think.
So I'll have to work on my
it's
Russian
to
first.
anybody here, but yeah, it's 11 volumes, and it's also, it was published in Israel, so.
And he also taught at the Open University of Israel. He's the winner of the Society of Biblical Literature Regional Scholar Award, the Junior Scholar Award from the Southwest Commission on Religious Studies, and the Golden Mustang Outstanding Faculty Award at SMU. Did I leave anything out?
Yeah. In addition to 250 articles, 2 books.
Okay, 2 books in the title.
So there will be 4.
Oh my goodness, wonderful. Well, we wish you only strength and the opportunity to write many more books in your area of expertise. And believe me, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. If you wouldn't mind standing here so that we can, or we could move that. Would you prefer to sit?
No, I can stand.
Okay.
I can do anything. Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, if we could move the podium, maybe.
Okay, so let's do that. So let's do that.
Yeah. It's easy enough to do. Easy. Camera on there. Stick. I'll move. Yeah. Just watch what you do.
I've got handouts.
Yeah, stick that on there. Okay. I don't think we need this, do we?
We do for the,
No.
It's not.
So I'm gonna take this away then, right? Right?
Yeah, this is the mic.
Our granddaughter will start Levine Academy next week. Ah. If handouts are needed, there are more there. So good evening, Chag Sameach, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I will talk on an unusual topic, which, however, has something to do with Shavuot, because Shavuot is the giving of the Torah. And the giving of the Torah is, of course, has an aspect that I think is a bit misunderappreciated, as one of our presidents used to say. So let's talk about this. I teach biblical studies most of all. I teach a wide range of courses, but biblical studies most of all, and that is specifically Hebrew Bible studies. And my main area of expertise is in Hebrew Bible, and most of what I have written is about the Hebrew Bible, although I have written on other topics as well. And when I speak when I teach students, when I speak to broader audience about the Hebrew Bible, I often have somebody maybe, raise their hand, maybe speak to me after the lecture, say, no, this God in the Hebrew Bible, this God is so tough. I especially hear it from Christians, of course, because they think that Jesus is all warm and fuzzy. Although my own teacher, who is a specialist in New Testament and a Christian, Professor Dennis MacDonald, one memorably said, don't you think that Jesus is always warm and fuzzy? When he comes back, he is going to kick butt. But yeah, it's and a lot of Jews feel that too. In part, it's Christian influence. In part, it's just developments within the Jewish community having to do with modernity and increased sensibilities. But when I get these questions or have somebody say it, I ask, and what exactly is God's toughness in the Bible? Why do you think that God is tough? And they usually say, well, there are so many demands. There are so many commandments. And there are such strict punishments for not observing them. As one student told me, well, what kind of God? He smites. And I tell him, no, you're reading it wrong. He forgives. But here is the thing. There is a deeper aspect in this, and that is, what is the real hallmark of an oppressive state? Is it having strict laws and strict punishments for not observing these laws? Or is it when those in power do not follow these laws? Is it when there is is the state really oppressive? Maybe when there is no law, when those in power do whatever the heck they want. And here is an interesting thing. God in the Bible does that as well. There are cases in the Bible. I can cite several, but we will look at least at two of them, where God acts in an unpredictable, unexpected, and seemingly unjust way. And this has very difficult consequences for everybody involved, including death, suffering, anguish, and broken families. Let's start with one, the story of Cain and Abel. Of course, right? Cain is a bad guy. We all know that. The name itself became proverbial, right? A traitor, a fratricide. But why did Cain actually kill Abel? What caused him to do that? Let's read about it. It's on the second page. It's Genesis chapter 4. From the top of the chapter. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. This is JPS translation, by the way. She then bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell, and we know what happened next. Now, tell me, please, why did God pay attention to Abel's sacrifice and not to Cain's?
The tradition,
Hmm?
yeah, the tradition is that one came from the heart and the other.
That's a tradition, but do we have a biblical proof for that? Right? Why does this tradition even exist? Because we want God to be just. We want God to act in an equitable manner, right? And that, by the way, oh, God saw something in Cain's heart that Cain was not doing it sincerely. That's, folks, that's Christian concept. Seeing in somebody's heart, that's a very Christian concept. Why do please?
If you're reading just this paragraph, and this is the only thing you know, it implies that both of them gave offerings from what they were responsible for growing or developing. And you wouldn't be able to tell just from these 5 sentences why Cain's offering from the soil, which is what he was responsible for, is worse than Abel's, which is part of the flock. So there's no way to know from that.
Tell me, please. Suppose we have read everything that precedes it. What would we think? Whose sacrifice was God expected to prefer, based on the previous texts?
I would think it would have been Cain's because it's all about the Garden of Eden and soil and the fruits and the earth.
And
the fourth verse.
and he is the firstborn. Yes, he is the firstborn, of course. And look at this, the first page. I put it in the biblical order. That is the end of Genesis chapter 1 on the right side. God said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is breath of life, I give the green plants for food.
Noah was
He-
the first one to.
Yes, right? In the beginning, all animals, including humans, were supposed to be vegetarians, frugivores. And Cain follows this commandment. He grows things from the earth. Abel, he grows sheep or whatever, and probably not just for wool. Probably not just for wool. It's Abel is violating this very clear decree, and yet God prefers Abel's sacrifice. And even that is not all, because there is a more specific commandment. Again, let's go to page 2, back to page 2. This is what God tells Adam when he and Eve are being banished from the Garden of Eden. Uh, well, let's look at verse 17 on the right side. To Adam he said, because you did as your wife said, and ate of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you, by toil shall you eat of it. All the days of your life, thorns and thistles shall sprout for you, but your food shall be the grasses of the field. Your food shall be the grasses of the field, not meat. By the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat until you return to the ground. It's all about the ground. It's all about growing things underground and then going there. Adam was supposed, even after being banished from the Garden of Eden, was supposed to grow things out of the ground, to grow plants, not to breed animals. Not to breed animals. And by extension, his family as well. And Cain does that diligently. He is elder brother after all. But Abel has a shortcut, right? It's much easier to produce meat using cattle. You don't have to grow anything. They just graze there, and you slaughter them, and you have a lot of calories. Based on this, we can expect that God will prefer Cain's sacrifice, and yet he prefers Abel's. Why? Why? It's ongoing punishment. It has never been revoked. But why does God prefer Abel's sacrifice?
Well, the text does say that it's the, I mean, couldn't the text have said that Cain brought the choicest of the fruit? It seems like that's what the rabbis really latched on.
Yeah. That's one. That's the you may go this way, but I have a shorter explanation for you. I have 3 words for you. 4th of July. Barbecue. Barbecue. No, this is what the Bible itself says time and again. God loves the smell of animal sacrifice. Burnt offerings. Reach nichoach. Pleasing odor, right? Usually translated into English. God likes it.
But you don't know that at this point, right?
It's the first time.
Well, but we will learn it very soon. Remember what Noah did? Well, the first thing Noah did after stepping on the dry land, make sacrifices. And it says loud and clear, God smelled the reach nichoach, the pleasing odor, and said, I will not do any floods anymore. It's okay. And even permitted eating meat, provided that you drain the blood and not eat the meat of fellow humans, of course.
And then Abraham does the same thing too.
And Abraham does, all of them do. And this expression, reich nichoach, it's like 40 times in the Bible. It's all over the place. God likes it, but God doesn't follow his own rules. Just because he likes barbecue. And look what it leads to. Look what it leads to. Cain kills Abel. Cain is banished. Adam and Eve are basically left without children. They have another son, and then the line continues all the way to Noah. But there is still the line of Cain. And judging by what happens towards the end of this chapter, chapter 4 of Genesis, there is Lamech, who seems to be super violent guy. So the evil continues to fester, and then we have the flood. And all because God likes barbecue and doesn't even try to hide it. Here is another example. Here is a big moment in the Jewish tradition, and that is, well, I know it's kind of confusing how it works here, but chapter 22 of Genesis. Akedah. Akedah. This is a painful and also very meaningful juncture in the biblical narrative, and also an event that is very big in Jewish tradition. But look at this. Look at the background of this. First of all, right? God, Genesis chapter 12, God speaks to Abraham for the first time and tells him, go to the land that I will show you. I'll make you a great nation. I'll give this land to your descendants, and I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And then this promise is repeated time and again, chapter 13, chapter 15, chapter 17, chapter 18. There are no children. And Abraham waits through his whole life. He is 99 years old. He tries to get a son, not with Sarah, but with his handmaid Hagar. God says, no, this is not how it works. It should be Sarah's son. Ishmael doesn't count. And then finally, after all this long wait, and at the point when Abraham and Sarah really would not be able to have children by any natural means, suddenly Sarah becomes pregnant. They have Isaac. What happens then? That's chapter 21. That's an immediately preceding chapter. Sarah wants Hagar and Ishmael banished, and God says, yeah, banish them. And Abraham sends them away. So by this time, by this juncture, by the time this chapter begins, Abraham again has only one son. And then it's not accidental. It's not accidental at all that chapter 21, the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, precedes chapter 22, because it makes it so much more dramatic. God tells Abraham, take Isaac, and God rather sadistically says, your only son, the one you love, go sacrifice him. Now imagine Abraham's bind. What is he really to do? It's catch 22. If he disobeys, then God may take offense and cancel everything. If he obeys, he's childless again. Where is then the promise to make him a great nation? And if he doesn't become a great nation, why does he need the land? And what about the blessing and the curse? It's really no win situation. God puts him in this way. For what? To test him? Here is the thing, right? We think when we read the Bible not very attentively that, well, God stopped it at the last moment. It didn't happen. Isaac survived. No big deal. Just 3 days of anxiety. But no, this sacrifice of Isaac that actually didn't happen it had very big impact. Turn over the page. Chapter 23. And it happens exactly after Isaac's sacrifice nearly happens. Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Did Sarah die because she was mortally afraid for Isaac and actually sure that Isaac will die there on the mountain? Did it kill her? But that's not all. That's not all. Look at the continuation. And Abraham, well, here is an interesting thing, right? Sometimes translators kind of hide the uncomfortable meaning there. So this translation says, and Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. But look at Hebrew there. Veyavo Abraham. And Abraham came. Right? What does it mean? Yeah, but why does he have to come to mourn for Sarah? Why is he not with her?
He wasn't there.
She wasn't there. She abandoned him. She abandoned him because he sets off to sacrifice Isaac from Beersheba. And he returns to Beersheba after that. Sarah, turns out, lives now in Hebron. It's not the same place. Sarah couldn't stay with him anymore. And what about Isaac? What about Isaac? Look at this. In the next chapter, Abraham sends his servant. I myself lost it. Okay, let me try to figure out how it works. Yeah. Yeah, here it is. You just need to turn it. No, okay. 25, yeah. What we actually need is the end of chapter 24. So, right, in chapter 24, Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and he does find Rivka, right? It's interesting. When Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son, there's no mention of Isaac being there. And then it turns out that Isaac really is not there, because when servant brings Rebecca back, look at verse 62 of chapter 24 on the left side. Isaac had just come back from the vicinity of Beer Lahai Roi, for he was settled in the region of the Negev. Anybody remembers what Beer Lahai Roi is? It's mentioned once previously. No, it's not. It's not the same place, but it is a place. Remember, if you remember, when Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, she falls out with Sarah, or Sarah falls out with her, and Sarah presses her. She runs away, gets lost in the desert with her son, and then she cannot find any water, sits under the bush preparing to die, and then God or angel shows her a well of water, and she calls this name Be'er Lahai Roi, the well of the one who sees me. So Isaac went and settled in a place that is associated with his banished half-brother. Is that to spite Abraham for nearly sacrificing him? He certainly bonded with Ishmael, because later when Abraham dies, Isaac and Ishmael come to bury him together. Family falls apart as a result of it. And look at the entire life of Isaac. Isaac is really a minor character compared to Abraham and Jacob. He does not achieve anything, basically. He is a kind of wuss. He is pushed around by his children, by his wife. Why is that? Is it because of trauma of being nearly sacrificed? Is it because he had PTSD all his life? Imagine you are a young man, your father brings you to the mountain, puts you on the altar, and holds a knife. And all of this because God is testing Abraham. No, let's not forget the initiator. So God is really acting in a cruel way and in an unexpected way, in unlawful way, I would say, in arbitrary way. Now, here is the thing. This divine behavior is not exceptional at all. In mythologies of all ancient cultures, certainly in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean area, gods just did what the heck they wanted. They were gods, and they did a lot of awful things. Hera and Athena started a Trojan War over an apple that was given to Aphrodite because she promised to Paris the love of the most beautiful woman. Poseidon persecutes Odysseus, prevents him for 20 years from returning home to his wife and children. Why? Because Poseidon thinks that Odysseus is too cocky, too self-reliant, and doesn't honor gods enough. Gods do behave in this way. Gods do behave in this way. But here is an interesting thing. When you have a lot of gods behaving this way, it's fine. It can work. Because you can, navigate your way between gods, try to forge a personal relationship with one of them, play them against each other, such as Odysseus was persecuted by Poseidon, but Athena was helping him, or Hera and Athena were against Troy, but Aphrodite was helping them, and so on and so forth. Of course, some gods have had more power than others, but even that can be manipulated. So Zeus didn't want Troy to be destroyed, so Hera seduced him, put him to sleep, and then did basically ensure the defeat of the Trojans behind his back. And when he woke up, he had a few choice words for her, but it was too late. And so that's all in the Iliad. But what do you do when you have only one god behaving in this way? The one and only God. Hmm? What did you say? Drives people kind of crazy, but there is a solution. And the solution is closely related to this day, to Shavuot. The solution is the covenant. Here's the thing. Of course, when we think about the covenant, when we think about the commandments, we think about it as Israel's obligations and the rewards for following the commandments and punishments for not following the commandments. But we forget that covenant is a contract. There are two sides to the covenant. There are two sides to any contract. And covenant is just as mandatory for God as it is for Israel. The Torah was given once and for all. God cannot change it. You think I'm kidding? Saying that God cannot do something?
It is not in heaven.
It is not in heaven. Well, yeah. In this whole episode, right, with rabbis telling God, no, we don't listen to you, right? We decide what Torah is, but
that's the end of Devarim,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Right,
the rabbis latch onto that, but that's the words of Devarim.
right.
Not too far from you.
It's not too far, definitely. Yeah. But here is an example from the Bible of God, of Torah being mandatory for God as well, and that is 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'll be done soon. And it's on the left side of the page, and I start with verse 4. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations." Samuel was displeased when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Well, from coming from Samuel, it's understandable, right? He's sidelined by the regime change. But here's what comes from God. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Samuel, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you. For they have not, for it is not you that they have rejected. It is me that they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them." Isn't God of two minds here? On the one hand, he says, asking for a king is rejecting me. Having a king is like worshiping other gods. Monarchy is another kind of idolatry. And yet he tells Samuel, listen to them, give them the king. So here's the thing. God certainly doesn't like the idea of anybody else being the king of Israel. But God can do absolutely nothing when people want to have a king. And why is that? Why is that? Because of the Torah. Because here is what the Torah says. Deuteronomy chapter 17. On the left side of the page, starting with verse 14. "If after you have entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you, and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, so as do all the nations about me." And by the way, when people ask Samuel for a king, they kind of quote a bit from this line. "You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God." Basically, it's in Hebrew, it's even strong. It basically says, once you want to have a king, you should have a king. God cannot overrule Torah. Torah is just as binding for God as it is for Israel. That is the often underappreciated aspect of the covenant. Now, here is one last thing that I'm going to say. Here is an interesting thing to think about in this respect. God was under no obligation, no duress, no nothing to agree to the covenant. Israel agreed to the covenant voluntarily. God agreed to the covenant voluntarily. God limited God's autonomy. God limited God's own power for the sake of God's relationship with Israel and with humanity in general, to make it more orderly, to make God's government not oppressive, not tough. And this idea, by the way, is lived on in the traditions of all religions whose roots go back into Hebrew Bible. Think about the Christian tradition, about God sacrificing his son, basically a part of God's self, in order to save everybody. Think about the tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Kabbalistic tradition, the Lurianic Kabbalah, with the idea of tzimtzum, contraction, and that the creation of the world only became possible when God voluntarily limited God's own reach and God's own power. This is one aspect in which the God of the Judeo-Christian and Muslim tradition as well is different from the gods of the preceding cultures and traditions. This is a self-limiting God. This is a God who voluntarily limits God's own power. And the mechanism of this limitation of God's power per Hebrew Bible is the covenant. And therefore, on Shavuot, we celebrate not only the binding of Israel by the obligations of the covenant, but also binding of God by the obligations of the covenant. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Was everybody hungry now? Ready to eat?
I am.
And then we'll come back for round two.
Okay.
Okay? So we invite everybody to have a bite to eat over here, and then we'll come right back and learn some more.
Be careful of the cords here. All right.
And then he's and it's interesting, when I did this, I compared it to the famous one. One God
Where did you grow up? Outside Philadelphia.
I wish I would have known you were coming. I would have seriously.
Sure. Here with an on-show.
There was some story about nobody.
Well, no, I will. I grew up in Sheriff.
Yeah.
My grandmother's grandparents were founding members of Sheriff, or the synagogue that became Sheriff. It's not a name I recognize.
Yes.
One of my famous and stories.
Yeah, he came back last Friday.
Oh.
No, it was like a good past.
So do you mostly teach undergrads or religious studies?
Mostly, we do stuff, I do stuff. I mean, especially in the Hebrew Bible.
And then when did he last night? Did you guys go there?
I do have first words.
He was great.
By human beings. He was a Jewish guy. His wife was actually a rabbi. And it was literally like, it was like this 18-year-old like now it must have like fallen down. Because of Indiana University. went on with the.
You're supposed to turn.
It's okay.
So you told us, like,
You get a big vendor, and he said those words in a way that the rabbi community.
Because
And I wanted to turn off the hours.
Oh, the,
Now what am I supposed to do? But,
but it was absolutely funny. But anyway, I was talking to one of my, one of the guys who works with the vegetable orthodox, he's like, oh, we should go to this other steak place. And I looked it up, and I was like, that's really inappropriate. No. That's very serious. And I said, I work for a not-for-profit, I can't even coach, $700 for a steak. What?
Oh, yeah,
$100
there
for the steak.
are a lot of
Because
streets
the
that
steak
in
was
that neighborhood, that area.
I'm like,
is called
are you paying?
Levine.
Yeah.
There are
I'm
neighborhoods
sure
here
it's
that
really inappropriate, but I was like, he put all these a lot of time for the deal, but I'm like, there's no way that I ever expect that. So, we were looking at these steak places in California, not California. They were somewhere between. So ridiculous now, but I was like, I feel like,
So what is the
I was like, when I used to do it for work, when I was a baker, I would call and order the long way to get delivered to my hotel, or I had to have stop on my way to the hotel, like, it was like dinner time. Oh, yeah. And did you ever order the special? Oh, my God.
I have really quizzes in every class, and they think that they know everything without and get it. It turns out that they don't know the most interesting parts. Which of course are not emphasized in Sunday school because they are difficult schedule for everybody to know. Oh, by the way, great story that happened about 12 years ago. So I have a student who does very poor Chinese, but I think maybe he's not good there.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
I tell him, show me your Bible. There's a Bible for family. Which of course a mere soul from everything. A lot of questions about those because those are the most
And I just, those are the parts we all read.
so it's funny, so but it's not only.
Yes, actually,
My wife broke the restaurants.
Yeah. She's been here during the summer with us, we've been putting together. She was at preschool, she was at kindergarten with Levine, and then went to today, but she was also on Guerrillas for, and then she converted officially, but, well, actually, yes. She did her job,
But we're all guilty of this. Right here in Wichita, every year we have and we have this big stack of pamphlet size, maybe like us, that we pass out. And it's facing Hebrew, English, really. You get close to the end, and there's one column where the Hebrew is uninterrupted, and the English just vanishes, and there's these little pictures of carnival masks and grog. And then the English comes back up. It's the part where they run wild and have their second day of looting.
We're doing that low budget.
Sure, that would be the case.
And the nuns and they took all the and it was really, and we done
So the thing is that after actually volunteered for the.
It did, but you know.
It's brutal. She volunteers and Marty Patrick go there. She tells her, don't tell anybody you're doing. meaning had he told, he would not have been recruited. So,
Although the Jews were highly designed.
Yeah.
That's why I didn't let
It was
on
just
that.
the most magnificent
I
trip
persuade these
and fun.
support members of our financial.
outside of
Yes, Western, yeah,
There's a difference between financial
yeah,
prosperity.
but we.
So it does say when the decree first comes down, that they're shocked.
And we were,
Throughout the
we
kingdom.
were, we always knew, like, the founders of the show. So we had to move from the show when they went to Westchester, so that we could walk.
By the way, had Haman succeeded, would have been worse than the Holocaust. Because the king
Yeah,
of
but we
the
don't
Arabs
need
was
to-
from India,
right.
by Ethiopia, meaning all the places
Drive
where
out
the
to Westchester.
all the
I know two words, we go to the.
So do they, so, I mean, I imagine,
Oval kind of.
you get a lot of pushback from
And.
students,
Listen, oh, Greenman, right.
academic
And,
point of view, but
Your
the
grandfather was raised in.
entire Hebrew Bible is a precursor.
Princess Bride. And we used to talk like from his chief then, and we would hear what my grand.
Like, a number of the Christians.
We never knew, like, what you want. I don't remember, they wanted, we were like, two of them, and he would, like, then, you know. Yeah, like, my mother's school was, you know, I'm not fixing food, we're staying all day, you know, the kids were Thursday. No, I think our varsity takes on.
I mean, we.
I'll take it. No. In the winter, New York, it's cold.
That, the fair.
And the Christian students are most uncomfortable with the.
We would play Arabs and Jews during that.
So
It was
that's,
so great,
that's
because
very
we go from four to like. We wonder how they learn that they got.
So,
I'm not sure. But.
They didn't have all that progress. They were developed properly. It was so great. And a lot of the people
And did you
migrated
make
from
studies?
that shul up to our shul. They were, yeah, eventually it was left of New Orleans, it was very.
No,
How do they respond to that?
I let him do it because
Yeah,
it's one of the ways of reading.
Absolutely.
It's over there, everything you know, that's
For all, like, for, no, we have like. Yeah, but then we go out there. And so my grandpa was just acting. He don't know, he just grew up there. And when I found out. Really, 26.
Right, right.
No, when he died.
But there, on the main square of the city, there is a house. It's all decorated with scenes from the Old Testament. There is explanation in German how these were used. I think there's no like Samson killing the lion that the remember.
Yeah. Oh my God. Oh, yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, my God.
That's
From the
pretty
Great
bad.
Gatsby, so,
That's right.
yeah.
I resent that he involved us. He knew I would probably get it.
You could like smell the carvings and things that were happening down there.
He saw this.
The Jordan Jason.
Living because he was going to DC, but he was going to Detroit.
Highway 69 are visited. But using it as the foundation of all three previous religions. Right, because if you don't, your right, you reference this, right? You're going to be as numerous
And he was just a regardless. And when and never did. I found a picture from here. I never
So, but if
I totally
That's not unusual, right?
but it's interesting.
Everybody's very
Well, but then you move to the newspaper.
And then it brought on.
There's a fascinating word.
Like on the Taylor's husband. Yeah, so they went to see this.
I think when last year,
So they went, I didn't read her, but they went to see his name was
That's why I couldn't come back up and crazy. He was blessed.
That was a Shavuot monkey. What's it? He's a good type of attorney.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, really?
I said, you know what, you would maybe close the book. No, I think it's depends on your view. So we. It's also.
Right. I actually meant, I went on.
What's in you new to be through the
I did.
a bit later.
For Melissa, but I don't know, I aware that the.
Right.
Landed.
That's supposed to be a
Full college essay.
can make it
Because they had to reroute the
Right.
trip.
Yeah.
I mean, they did.
Because
They did.
only
They did.
the people that
They
they
wanted
want
to.
to
That's what I mean, I've had to deal with it already. I don't remember.
Well, they've already, some already have it, like, the first grade kids are already back. Right, just still not. So,
Now, it's our own.
oh, yeah, because everyone.
Why? Curious about
Stop.
So,
Stop. They did last day, it was for- yeah, they have to be the same.
You may.
It wasn't like, it's like all the groups, you know, all of us together at some point, but it wasn't.
Anytime in translation.
Some
Translation is a
Yeah.
has an agenda, it can't help it. There's no way to translate it. When you teach Torah in English, you have a translation. When you would look
Yeah, that's such as for example, some translations are
Oh, is she going back? Oh, I bet she was saying.
I have almost no experience. Like, when I approach a verse, I had several translations. And then kids I've been reading this year's Torah cycle. I've been reading each week's Parsha with Everett Fox. His translation has a very commentary. But it's a fair comment. It's a very correct comment.
I know.
I've always struggled. I've been trying to my whole life.
You said when you were in Israel.
Yeah, it's very
Okay, so you okay to do it in
Oh.
It's not what it says in the
even the JTS.
Oh, yeah.
The end of last year.
No, yeah, no, you would be.
So do we need one more happening for?
That's a
Robert.
Robert Alder.
That's a Catholic seminary.
Yes, yes. It was really interesting. Talk about, you must do 5 times and translate the Bible by
We'll talk about Ukraine.
and he was sticking in the knife. Yes.
There's also, I would struggle to come up with a specific example, but I know some of these like the art scroll stone. It translates, it often translates, I've been told, it often translates and includes Rashi's voice into the translation. Not counting commentary, but just like, here's the Hebrew, here's the English. And the English doesn't just say what the Hebrew says, the English says what Rashi says the Hebrew says.
Yes, does that.
But with the indication.
So it's yes, it's done.
Right.
So they'll put in opposite
Right, and just straight up as if it were shown.
Are you ready for round 2?
We tried to figure out.
Thank you very much.
For this one, I wrote down
I'm sure.
You don't go through.
All right, everyone. I think it's time to continue with Dr. Frolov, and thank you again for a wonderful first session. that made us all think and challenge ourselves. And now we look forward to hearing about your impressions of what's happening on the other side of the world. Thank you so much.
Well, yeah, I think it was written down as insider's perspective. I'm a bit of insider, but not that much because I haven't lived in that area for 30 years. I have visited, my last visit to Russia was in 2019. And I was planning to keep coming back from time to time. I have a very, very, very good friend there. Still my best friend, my college buddy, and still my best friend. We talk on Skype every week, but of course it doesn't quite replace meeting in person. I haven't been in Ukraine since 1996, so but I have some experience. Let me maybe. No, most of my talk, I will just go. Maybe I'll just tell a story of my life, and then certain observations would come in. But for now, I will start from the very end, because lest I forget, because this is something really important, and that has to do with one thing that I'm doing right now. And one class, as the rabbi has mentioned, one class that I teach, and I teach it quite regularly, in part because it's a very popular class. It's called Religion and the Holocaust. And one thing that we discuss in the beginning of the class is what is genocide. And I tell them that the term genocide was coined specifically in order to categorize the Holocaust. It was coined, it did not exist before the Second World War. It didn't exist before the Holocaust. A Jewish lawyer by the name of Raphael Lemkin of Polish origin coined it when he discussed in an article what to do with those who committed these crimes that became the Holocaust. And in part because of the Holocaust, a lot of people believe that in order for a certain event to be categorized as a genocide, a huge lot of people have to be killed. Like 6 million Jews and lots of others died in the Holocaust. So it should be at least in the millions or the hundreds of thousands, something like this. Now, the number of people who have died in Ukraine so far, if you deduct those who die in the actual combat on the battlefield, nobody knows for sure. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, certainly not yet on the scope of the Holocaust. But here is the thing. Right? The legal definition of genocide does not say anything about numbers. For it to be genocide, all you need is first government sponsorship, and then the intent to destroy a certain group of people, defined by their ethnicity, defined by their race, defined by their religion, defined by their political view, defined by their class, you name it. There were a lot of different genocides just in the last 100 of years. And from this point of view, what is happening in Ukraine now is genocide. That is because the main reason of this war is the belief of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin personally that there is no such thing as Ukrainian people, that Ukrainian people should not exist, that Ukrainians are actually Russians, that they should be Russians. And Putin did not say that. Putin, last summer, Putin published a very long article, a very long historical review trying to prove that Ukrainians are actually Russians, or that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He did not say what should be done to those Ukrainians who do not agree to be Russians, who want to be Ukrainians. And there were no official statements on that matter, but there were publications on the site of the news agency that is basically the mouthpiece of the Russian government, that basically said that Ukrainians should be forced to become Russians, and those who want to remain Ukrainians need to be liquidated. And here's the translation of one of them. Keep it, read it at leisure. This is today's face of evil. This is actually some things that are suggested in this particular column. And I checked, I read the Russian text, I checked the English translation, it is true to the original. Some things that are suggested in this column, even Hitler did not dream of them. So that is something to be kept in mind. What is happening is not just war, it's not just aggression, it's not just a war of conquest, it's not just unprovoked attack, it is genocide.
The Russians have also, very cynically, but they have also suggested that the Ukrainian fascist Nazi government is attempting genocide of Russian speakers.
Which is not true, because there no such genocide has been ever attempted or planned. Nobody in Ukraine. I mean, there are some extreme nationalists in Ukraine. Even they never suggested to kill those who consider themselves Russians. There has been no such suggestion. There have been. When the pro-Russian president was overthrown in 2014, the Ukrainian parliament passed a very ill-considered bill that prohibited teaching Russian in schools, I think, which was then vetoed by the acting president. So it never was actually enforced, but certainly that was used by the Russian government as a pretext to attack Ukraine. First to help the separatists, and then to attack Ukraine as a whole. That's what I wanted to say. The thing the thing is, right, Ukrainian nation, maybe it did not exist until, well, let me talk about it a bit later, okay? Well, I'll get to that. So, I was born in 1959 in St. Petersburg, Russia. I grew up there. The city was still bearing the scars of the Second World War, when it was besieged by the Nazis. By the time I was born, life had more or less returned to normal. At that time, there was no shortages of basic foodstuffs that would set in the 1970s and especially the 1980s. I had a pretty happy childhood. My parents bought, by this time it was possible to buy an apartment in the Soviet Union, not just receive it from the government. It was possible to buy. It was kind of co-op. It was a co-op. It was called co-op. It had 3 rooms. So it was kind of 2-bedroom, I guess, in American parlance. When I was born, my parents and my grandparents all lived in 1 room. How I was conceived still remains a mystery. They don't tell me. But then I think I was about 4 when they moved into into this new apartment that was new construction, that however bordered on an older neighborhood. That was a pretty rough neighborhood. And my parents always told me, don't go there. And of course I did. My friends and I got beaten up a couple of times there. Not really much because there was nothing to take from us. We didn't have any cash, no credit cards, no cell phones, certainly. I mean, telephones was another matter. A lot of people did not have any telephone at home. In order to get one, you had to wait for years. So if you need, say, an ambulance, you run to the nearest public phone or to your neighbors who are lucky enough to have a phone. So there was also community lines and whatnot. But here is the thing, right? I grew up as a free-range child. So my parents, from the age of 10 or so, my parents were not watching. I mean, for some time I was required to play within the view from our windows, which were on the third floor. After that, there was no such requirement at all. And the growing children, especially the boys, had their own community. It was called the war, a courtyard. It was not really something very close, very tightly enclosed, but it was a space where boys from certain buildings would come together, play, and fight. And what in this space, it was basically the law of the jungle. Those who were the strongest and the most brutal were the leaders. Everybody who could not really throw a heavy punch were the underdogs. I was always the underdog because in my whole life I have never been able to bring myself to punch another human being. And that is why I'm even telling this, because this is exactly the environment in which the current president of Russia grew up. It was a different neighborhood. He was older. He is 7 years older than I am. But by the way, my second cousin says that who is about the same age as Putin. He grew up in that area. He says, "Such a pity I didn't kill him then." Of course, I don't think he was able to kill anybody, but that's his feeling now. But here is what Putin learned as a boy. And he was, I don't know how tough or brutal he was at that time, but he was certainly small, slender. He still is. So, and from the his childhood photographs, he was not very large and strong. And he probably learned only one thing, and that is if you don't want to be punched, you need to punch yourself. If you don't want to be stepped upon, you need to step upon others. And he actually said it at one point, not so long ago, loud and clear. That was the law of the courtyard. The weak get beaten. So where his psychology comes, it's very clear to me. It is, and to everybody, to anybody who grew up at that particular time. Now, as I was growing up, going to school, learning things, there was one thing that I was hearing as a constant refrain. We live in a really, really, really big country. We have the largest land mass in the world. We have 12 time zones in our country. We have a lot of minerals. We have the tundra, we have the conifer forest, we have any kind of forest, we have steppe, we have deserts, we have subtropical places, we have everything. We're big. And all that came crashing down in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. Now, here is an interesting thing. Generally speaking, our time is the time when empires are falling apart. Empires are, by now, the thing of the past. It started with Spanish and Portuguese empires in the 18th and 19th century, then came the turn of the British Empire and the French Empire, and slightly before them, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of them came crashing down. And it caused some difficulties, some anguish, and some difficulties for the nations that were the core of these empires, for the Spanish, for the Portuguese, for the British, for the French. And it took these nations quite some time to get over the fact that they are not the empire anymore, that they are just a nation like any other. For Spain, it took like almost 200 years. Turkey still hasn't gotten over it. The British did at some point. The French did, right? The Dutch certainly did. And then there was the Russian Empire, which fell apart in the revolution of 1917, but then was put together by the communist government in Russia. They did lose some territories, but then they gained others. So it was maybe slightly smaller, but still huge. And then after the Second World War, the whole Eastern Europe, it was not technically part of the Soviet Union, but it was basically under their, not just under their influence, but basically under their jackboot. And suddenly it was no more. And Russians never got over it, because they had been taught for all their lives that to take pride in the bigness, the hugeness of their country. They were missing it. And they had absolutely nothing to show for their loss. Because ultimately, Britain, France, even Spain developed into modern, prosperous, stable, peaceful, very well organized countries. They can take pride in their achievements without the empire. Russians have nothing to show for it. The Soviet Union was the source of raw materials for the industrialized countries. Russia became even more so. I think it was the late Senator John McCain that said that Russia is a gas station that pretends to be a country. And Putin really hated McCain, I can tell you that. Not just for that, but for a lot of other things. So and and they knew it, even though the standard of living did improve in the 21st century, especially in the first decade when oil was very expensive. They still had the feeling that there is this void that is not filled. So they are longing for the restoration of their empire. And as somebody, I think it was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who once said, Russia cannot be empire without Ukraine. Russia does hold the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, Belarus, to some extent, Caucasus under its sway, but it's not enough. It's not enough for Russia to be an empire again. They need Ukraine, which is why I don't know. I mean, the polls of public opinion in Russia are notoriously unreliable simply because people don't trust that the pollsters would not, would not report on them to the secret police if they say something that the government might not like. But I would think that a substantial part of the population does support this war because they do want to be an empire again, and they know that this is the only way of achieving that. Now, Ukraine. As I was growing up in school, we knew that there are 15 republics, 15 constituent republics in the Soviet Union, each of which represents a certain substantial nation. There are also so-called autonomous republics within Russia and within some of the other republics as well. There are it was called national districts, things like this, doesn't matter. So there's a lot of different ethnicities there. But it was seen as more of a curiosity, not as a real thing. Because borders did not exist. You could travel anywhere in the Soviet Union. You could barely, just like between many states in the United States, right? You barely notice when you cross the state line. Sometimes there is a sign saying "Welcome to Michigan" or whatever, or "Welcome to Texas," but sometimes there is none. So you don't even know in which state you are. Same thing there. It was all the talk about there being different nations, different ethnicities. It did not register. It was seen as something quaint, some kind of curiosity. It was not seen as there really being different identities. It was not seen as different groups of people wanting to create their own statehood. On parallel with that, however, it was not really, maybe I'm not correct. There were some movies dealing with it, but we were aware of the strength of nationalist feelings in some places, in some very specific places, which included Lithuania and Western Ukraine. There were a lot of legends circulating about nationalist Ukrainian guerrillas still being active somewhere in the forest there, and they were really active for some time after the Second World War, although they were not able to receive any help from the West because they were thousands of miles from the nearest NATO country. They still resisted until like 1953, something like that. So they held out for a lot of time after the war. There were even jokes about Ukrainian nationalists bidding their time to start the war again, such as, for example, somewhere in eastern Ukraine, an old man pours motor oil on flower bed. His granddaughter says, "Grandpa, what are you doing? All the flowers will die." "Let the flowers die. The machine gun will be safe." So yeah, there was kind of awareness that there is still this uh, nationalist feeling in Ukraine and in some other places as well. It was not everywhere. I traveled to Ukraine, and in many places I barely could hear anybody speaking Ukrainian. It's still the case. That is actually an interesting phenomenon that is taking place right now. A lot of people in Ukraine who speak Russian, who barely know Ukrainian, now consider themselves Ukrainians, thanks to Putin. Putin is really building the Ukrainian nation. But then came the what was called perestroika. Right? Then came the gradual collapse of the Soviet Union. And here is what I was watching with some interest and a bit of bewilderment. Because what was it that brought down the Soviet Union? It was not a pro-democracy movement. It was not the desire to switch from from ineffective socialist system to more effective capitalist system. What brought the Soviet Union down was ethnic nationalism. Different republics and even autonomous republics and kind of sub-republics within the Soviet Union. When once the grip of the party and the Soviet government weakened, they started jockeying for creating their own statehood. This movement was the strongest in the Baltic states because they had been relatively recent addition to the Soviet Union, only conquered in 1940. Then Germans came, then Germans were defeated, and they again became the part of the Soviet Union. But of course, in Ukraine, this nationalist movement was also very strong. And the more I think about it, especially now, the more I think that when we discuss these issues, we really fail to make a distinction between nationalism and imperialism. Because we think, well, nationalism is bad, right? Talk about, I don't know, white nationalism, right? And we equate it with white supremacy and with neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan and whatnot, right? But actually, look at the world right now. And if you have read George Orwell, 1984, right? There are 3 mega states there in the world. That's it. How many states do we actually have? In excess of 200. And why is that? Why do we have that? That's nationalism. That's nationalism that ensured the national self-determination and liberation of all these peoples. It is nationalism that destroys the empire. Nationalism is actually a positive thing. What is negative thing? And of course, nationalism can become that under certain conditions. What is negative is imperialism. That is certain. And here is an interesting thing. What played a substantial role in the Soviet Union falling apart was Russian nationalism. Because it was not just the Ukrainians or the Baltic states or the Central Asian republics that wanted independence. Russians were saying, we don't need them. Let them go. We want our own Russian state. But then they got it. It turned out that they're missing being the empire, being the core nation of the empire. Let me see. What else? Oh, yeah. So, one last. Am I taking too much time? No? Okay. maybe one last experience, and that is certainly from the mouth of the horse, and that is now. 1976, I started my undergraduate studies at Leningrad University, which was still named after Andrei Zhdanov, who was one of Stalin's henchmen. And somebody joked that it's like having an Al Capone University. But I was majoring in modern history at that point, and then I went all the way to a PhD. After I completed, at that time in the Soviet Union, there was no such thing as bachelor's, master's, and so on. There was this thing called full university course, which was 5 years, and then after that you could go for a PhD if you wanted to and could do it. So, but after I completed this full university course, 5 years, I was drafted into the Soviet military. Now the draft in the Soviet Union worked like this. All able-bodied men, when they reached the age of 18, were drafted. Those who went to college received a deferment. But in every college or university, there was kind of equivalent of ROTC, only it was mandatory. So all boys had to do their military studies, and then upon graduation, they received the rank of second lieutenant. And then some were drafted. It was selected. Not everybody drafted after that. It was selective draft, and I was drafted not because I was unlucky, but because my parents did not have enough connections. The connections of my parents were only sufficient to keep me out of Afghanistan. So I served not far from St. Petersburg, north of St. Petersburg, not far from the border with Finland. It was actually called Station 168. It's 168 kilometers from St. Petersburg. So here is the thing. When I hear about how Russian military is fighting in Ukraine right now, I easily recognize what I saw at that time. And it was a disaster, frankly. It was a disaster. Now, first of all, both soldiers and officers were drunks. Soldiers were not permitted to drink under any circumstances, and they still sneaked, smuggled drink by any means necessary. It was pretty much officers had to be like like prison guards to keep them from that, and even that did not work. Now, here is one interesting factoid. I served in an artillery regiment, and it was towed artillery, so we had towing machines, which were on tracks, and on each and every machine there was a sign. On all of them, on each of them, there was a sign in big letters saying, "Antifreeze is poison." Because it contains alcohol, so soldiers were drinking it and getting poisoned. Officers were completely incompetent. Not to mention they were drunks and wife beaters and whatnot. Yeah, that was done too. Equipment did not work. Never ever. When we were doing training exercises, the shells were flying in every direction but the one they were supposed to, or they didn't fly at all. Now I have to enter a caveat. Now the unit where I served was certainly not the elite, not the best. Probably was one of the worst. But still. Now, I'm not at all surprised that Russian soldiers are looting in Ukraine, because they were looting in Russia in peacetime. I mean, of course, they could not just come and take, because they were prosecuted for that, but they stole a lot of things. Rapes happened. There were cases of soldiers shooting each other. So, and now for the crowning factoid, the morale. Now I served from September 1981 through September 1983. So it's May 1983. It's, if some of you remember, it's the time of Falkland War. Remember that Britain and Argentina over the Falkland Islands. So I am guarding an armament warehouse with 10 soldiers. So there are 11 of us there. I sit there in the building and read military magazines called Foreign Military Review. There were these magazines for the officers, Soviet Military Review and Foreign Military Review. So I read Foreign Military Review, and there is a full-page photograph of English paratrooper in the Falkland War in full battle equipment. And one of my soldiers is passing by, looks at this photograph and says, without any sarcasm, without any irony, just matter-of-factly, well, if just one guy like this shows up here, of course we'll all surrender. So I mean, of course, I have not been familiar with the Russian military in any way since 1983, and just like a lot of military experts in the West, I think I was misled by the claims that it has been modernized in the last decade or so, that it has been. First of all, there was voluntary service introduced, so some of them were just like American soldiers, not draftees. Second, they got a lot of new equipment. It was kind of rebuilt. The whole structure was rebuilt. Turns out not so much. Not so much. I still recognize the whole Soviet military, in which I had the misfortune to serve. Like Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, there are experiences that you can easily go without. I don't know. I really don't have a grand finale for this. So I mean, if you have questions, I can answer. Uh,
So I know the media is very highly controlled in Russia. Do people still in Russia believe that Putin is right and that Ukraine is really the enemy?
yeah, because this is what they want to believe.
But what about the people?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Just I'll just answer this question. It is. Well, let's put it this way: there are different categories. There is the older generation that barely knows how to use a computer or not is not using it at all. It's also possible. Doesn't have smartphones. Those rely on the TV, and it is still the attitude that I think also prevailed in the United States until like 1980s or 1990s. Oh, they said it on TV. It must be true. Right?
But that happens here.
Right? So today nobody believes anything, right? But even the even in the younger generation, generations especially, a lot of people would want to believe that this is a war of no choice. They said that Russia had to wage this war because Ukraine or NATO were ready to attack them, that there was genocide of Russian population being prepared in Ukraine and so on. So they want to believe it, and the propaganda gives them what they want to hear, and they're happy about it. I know people in the United States, mostly ethnic Russians, who are the same way.
Even though they have American media.
Even though they have American media, even though it takes some effort to get Russian media in this country, it's not difficult, but it requires some effort. So and some expense too. So yeah, that's how it is. I mean, they want the empire, and this is something I never mentioned, but here is the thing. It's not that Putin came and took over Russia. Russia wanted Putin. Russia wanted him. Putin is Russian ideal. Putin is the kind of leader that Russia has been looking for. I don't know since when, since Peter the Great, since Ivan the Terrible. I don't know since the founding of the Russian state, because Russians have always been looking for a leader who would be strong on the one hand, but not brutal. Not brutal towards Russians. I mean, not killing people without any reason by the thousands like Stalin, for example, or Ivan the Terrible. So killing only his actual opponents. Yes, finally, after so many years, after centuries, you cannot take Putin away from Russians. They will fight for him. All the talk about Russians rising against Putin, or him being overthrown in the palace coup, or having to retire because of losing the war. He might lose the war in Ukraine, but he will not. He's not going anywhere. And if he goes away from natural causes, then there will be somebody who will be just like him or worse. Now, you want to ask something?
So, I mean, initially there were people, the news was showing that there were people in Russia that were demonstrating against the war, but maybe based on what you were saying, it was more of the younger generation who
Yes.
tend to be a little bit more progressive, who didn't grow up with the same nationalism. And
There are many of them, but they're still a small minority. That's the thing, and there have been, I mean, by now there have been a lot of disappointments. I have two good friends back in St. Well, one of them is actually kind of back and forth between St. Petersburg and Moscow, and both of them are strictly against the war, and I was totally happy about this. I mean, when the war started, I called one of them, and he says, and his wife is there, and his wife says, "We're ashamed. We feel nothing but shame." But at the same time, another friend, and he is a bohemian personality. He is a playwright, and he runs in the bohemian circles. And he says, I lost a lot of friends over this war because I'm against it. So even in bohemian circles, there are quite a few people who support this war. Mm-hmm.
This question is probably, it's not probably, it's one that's important. Probably could talk about it for hours, people write books about this, but so we ask it, what is it about Russia and the Russian people that makes them want that kind of leadership?
Because they had this empire for many centuries. They are used to having it. Plus, in Russia, I mean, I don't want to, I am very careful about going into discussions that may sound racist, but here is the thing. There is, it's not really the spirit of the nation. Let's put it this way. There is culture. Every nation has its own culture. And the core of Russian culture is that it is the opposite of individualistic. It is all about the community and its leader. Basically, Russian culture equates any kind of separate existence of an individual as, first of all, as being simply dangerous for this individual and for the community. And second, as a kind of things being out of order, basically, a kind of not really maybe even an abomination. No, there is. In my time there was a joke. Then I heard that actually this joke also exists in America, only with a different character. So it's. But the joke, as I heard it, was this: when an American sees a huge, expensive house on the hill, American said, "One day I will earn enough money to buy me a house like this." And when a Russian sees a house like this, one day I will burn this house down. And I heard that in America, they thought instead of Russian, there is Irish. But yeah, it is a culture that is frankly, although Russia is mostly a Christian and Orthodox country, it's a culture that is complete opposite of the culture of the Hebrew Bible, because Hebrew Bible is all about the individual. The Hebrew Bible is very wary of the political state, right? All the thing with the kings and even King David, right? The best of the best is awful, actually, if you read carefully there. But in Russia, and it is part of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's all about dependence on the state. It's all about dependence on state, especially on the supreme leader, on the king. No matter if the king is called president or prince or whatever, it's still the king. You had a question?
I apologize if this veers off topic, but you talked about your upbringing in college and the military. What was being Jewish
Oh, yeah.
As a part of that?
Yeah, it's So in a few words, right? I really smirk when in the United States they say Jews are white. I mean, Whoopi Goldberg said something along those lines. I mean, in Russia, Jews certainly were not white. And just like in Germany under the Nazis. So it was not an easy experience. Now, here, can I take 5 minutes? Okay. So here's an interesting thing. Now, Jews were certainly discriminated against. And in order to avoid discrimination, there were two things. There were two ways. Either to pretend that you are not Jewish, or to be a very loyal, very, not just loyal, but, rabidly loyal party member. Now, my parents, and especially I, at first pretended that I'm not Jewish. Because internal IDs in Russia, which were mandatory in the Soviet Union, which were mandatory for everybody, they had line 5, ethnicity. So everybody's ethnicity was written into their IDs. And the child's ethnicity was required to follow the ethnicity of the parents. The loophole was that if parents have different ethnicities, then it could be either of them. Now, my maternal grandfather supposedly was Russian. It's an interesting thing in its own right, because everybody in the family believed that my grandpa Nikolai was totally Russian. He came from Russian countryside, very far from the Pale of Settlement. So when I took DNA test, I expected to be 75% Ashkenazic Jewish, 25% Russian. Turned out I'm 84% Ashkenazic Jewish and only 8% Russian. Turned out Grandpa Nikolai was at least 25% Jewish. Go figure. But because my maternal grandfather was Russian, then my mother was registered in her ID as Russian. Therefore, I was registered in my ID as Russian. That was sufficient to be admitted to the Leningrad University and to major in history, which was a very prestigious major, very, very tough competition there. But it was not enough to get a teaching job. I worked at a library. That was, and here's the thing. No matter that your ID says Russian, and my first name, last name are all very typically Russian. There's nothing Jewish about them. I was immediately recognized as not Russian, as Jewish. How they did it, I don't know. So I'm drafted into the military. I come to the personnel department of the division, and the personnel officer looks at me. I'm with him for like 2 or 3 minutes. He looks at me and says, "Oh, you're in luck. Your commanding officer is Jewish." Now, my document said I'm Russian. I don't have a typical Russian first or last name. He immediately recognized I was Jewish. I don't know. This is how it worked. So I worked at the library until we left for Israel in 1990. You had questions?
Your whole family go to Israel?
Yeah, everybody, pretty much everybody. Well, it was my wife, our son, me, and then my parents. That was pretty. Then my grandmother joined us. So we decided that our son needs circumcision. He was already 5 by that time, and that required a rabbinic approval, right? By the rabbi approved by the chief rabbinate. So we go to a rabbi, and my grandmother comes with us. And I haven't seen a live rabbi for decades. I want to talk to a rabbi. She comes with us, and the rabbi only talks to her. And after talking to her, says, with such a grandma, I have no doubts it's a Jewish family. So yeah, our whole family left. I mean, my wife, her father remained in Russia. He's a keyboard Russian. He died of COVID. Unfortunately, yeah. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, very
Thank
much.
you.
It was a pleasure to have you, and
Pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed it.
maybe we'll be able to invite you another time.
I would love that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank
You kept us all engaged, even at a late hour, without any problem whatsoever. And it's very easy to
you never fell asleep, right?
it's very easy to see why your students think you're a dynamic professor and keeps their attention without any question whatsoever. So thank you very much. Chag Sameach to you. Chag Sameach to everybody. We'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow morning.
Very nice meeting you.